about myself. I mean, it may seem strange that, you know, someone who's been involved with the very traditional things, doing exhibitions and painting shows and all of that, would suddenly start working with very high-tech instruments. But I mean, two things maybe. I'm still involved with some traditional things. It's not that I left the physical world entirely. And, you know, and I've changed, you know, direction before. I used to be, as, you know, I used to be more of a writer, and I've always wanted to be more of a kind of a, you know, someone who likes writing and teaching and all of that. And to run institutions is sometimes, you know, rather demanding, and you end up doing mainly administration and fundraising and all of that. And to a certain extent, what I'm doing now takes me a little bit back to where it all began, because I mean, I became friendly with some artists, and I started to write texts for them, and I started to, I mean, I became a curator just because I was friendly with artists, actually, and I started to install their things, and one thing led to another. And although this is a techie environment I'm working in, it's kind of back to where it all began, because again, I'm working very, very closely with some artists. And Acute Art is it's a rather small place. I'll see if I can share the screen. I forgot how one does this.
Sure, there should be a green button called share screen. Okay.
Yeah. We'll
That's
see.
great.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff. But let's say view. It should be slideshow, no?
Yes.
Yeah. So Acute Art, it's a, you know, it's just a laboratory. It's just a studio basically, and we're 8 or 9 people or so. But then we have lots of technical support, and people don't work full time for us, but they help realizing artists' visions basically. So if someone is good at you know, coding and doing shiny surfaces for BMW or Mercedes or Porsche or something, they can maybe do a surface for Jeff Koons too. You know, so we have, you know, often put together small teams to do you know, specific things. This is a little mini film here.
In real life, when someone rescues another person or offers aid of any kind, there is a transfer of energy. Will the same happen in a virtual reality?
Oops.
In real life, when someone rescues another person.
You know, that's a little clip from a piece we did with Marina Abramovic. And so it all started some years ago when, you know, I was still working for the museum in Stockholm. And the Moderna Museet in Stockholm is not a huge museum like, you know, like the Pompidou or the Tate, but it's a pretty paradigmatic museum of modern art that has some great, you know, things in its, not only in its collection, but actually in its history. It has a kind of techie kind of thread that runs through the programming, I have to say, a kind of machine-like fantasy thread that maybe starts with Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp was actually quite involved with the museum in the 1960s, and he was there. And the museum has the biggest Duchamp collection in Europe, and Picabia, and you know, it runs all the way up to contemporary things involving new technologies. And there's a kind of a glamorous moment, I have to say, when a Swedish technician who later on moved to the US, or rather early moved to the US, and became the kind of engineer of the pop generation, worked for the museum as an ambassador in the US. And his name was Billy Cleaver. And Billy was, you know, really the engineer for Rauschenberger and Jasper Johns and for John Cage and for even for Warhol with his Silver Clouds. And he was the initiator together with Rauschenberg and a few other artists of something called EAT. And yeah, as I explained to your colleague just a few minutes ago, who actually wrote a dissertation on EAT, so I mean, she would know much more than me. But it's an interesting part of our collection in Stockholm that we have some of the key works from that from that movement. And EAT was really an example of something that I'm interested in, namely, the kind of an attempt to bridge the gap between the disciplines or between the different worlds, the world of engineering and technology and the world of culture, theater and performance and art. And EAT actually did involve some of the greatest artists of the 1960s. It was actually a quite global network in the end. I have another friend who used to be the editor of Artforum, also wrote on EAT, who explained how big this network at some point became. But in our collection, we primarily looked at things by Rauschenberg and John Cage, etc. And these are fantastic, but they happened in the mid-19 or late 1960s, and it can become a little bit exhausting to simply, or a little bit boring actually, and monotonous to go on about that. Everything important didn't happen in the late 60s. Things have moved on. And what would it be to create a similar dialogue today? And in a way, this sounds maybe bombastic or slightly bragging or something, but the mission is not similar. We're trying to think what would it be if important artists, or let's say exemplary artists who do things today, if they get access to these new visual possibilities. And so we've worked with lots of younger artists who are actually coders themselves, but we've also worked with artists who absolutely could not have done this on their own. And of course they have big studios often, and they do many things where certain things are outsourced. Anyhow, experiments in art and technology had a similar, there was a counterpart to that in Los Angeles, actually, at LACMA. Art and Technology was an exhibition around 1970. And so there are a number of such interesting moments. There's the Nanyum Pike show that travels the world right now. And it's another example of art and technology. And because, I mentioned these because maybe one could say that, the dominant attitude in the art world has not necessarily been one of enthusiasm when you talk about technology. Thinking of art criticism and art theory, it's often been more of a critique of technology and a certain kind of skepticism. I remember at the school in Frankfurt, where I was teaching for all these years and actually even running the school, I remember a moment when we had a kind of almost like a fight in the faculty, where we had two Austrian teachers. One of them was Peter Weibel, who started an art and technology institute, the Institute für Neue Medien in Frankfurt. He then moved on to Karlsruhe, where he became the director of a quite famous art and technology institution called ZKM, Zentrum für Kunst und Medien. And the other guy was Peter Kubelka, a filmmaker who was actually much more classical, and who wanted to emphasize older mediums, and he kind of attacked Weibel for saying and claimed that it's more important for an artist to know how to bake bread than to create electronic kitsch with the tools of the military complex. I remember that way of putting it, and I have to say that most of my life I've maybe been more closer to those bread baking people than to the military industrial complex. But today I guess it's a little bit different. Everything, you have your piece of bread on the breakfast table, but next to it is a little iPhone that it's an unbelievably powerful machine. So I guess we're actually, all of us, most of us, very linked to these virtual possibilities, and they're woven into our everyday practice. So it's no longer an alternative. We can both bake bread and be involved with these things, because we are anyhow. There are exceptions to the rule of techno skepticism in the art world, and Nanyum Pike would certainly be an example, and I'm sure you know as much about him as I do. We recently did a piece at the museum. It was one of the last things I actually initiated, called Mud Muses, and it's to do with the tradition of art and technology and the promises that that this dialogue seems to offer. And it starts with a piece called Mud Muse that actually premiered at LACMA many years ago, and it's in the Moderna Museet collection. And we took that kind of a mud muse object, this kind of strange pool of mud that makes weird sound, as a kind of as a starting point. And I wasn't the curator. It was a Danish colleague of ours called Lars Bang Larsen. And it's now maybe 3 or 4 years ago that, I was asked if I wanted to be involved a little bit more with these things. If you're a museum director, I think you all know that, you try to find, you try to find support and partners and sponsors and all of that all the time. And Stockholm is not as impressive a place for art and technology as California, but for European standards, I have to say it's actually one of the more interesting places. There's a company called Spotify that I'm sure you've heard of, and there's a company called Skype, and there's a kind of telephone pioneer called Ericsson, and they're all Stockholm-based companies. So I always try to bring them into the museum and sometimes managed. And at some point at one of these conferences, when we were mainly discussing new virtual possibilities, I was asked to kind of introduce artists into this world, and they wanted very well-known artists, and just to see what would happen. So, I helped them to create, this was just, a tiny group of people. And that's what a little bit later on became Acute Art. So we did a project with Marina Abramovic and with Olaf Eliasson, a piece called Rainbow. And actually a strange, perfectly shiny object by Jeff Koons. And, one can say, why these artists? But, of course they are actually exemplary to it, and I can see that for different reasons they would want to test this. I don't know if Jeff is ever going to return to this, but, he's a perfectionist, and it's interesting to do things that are more perfect than anything can be in the physical world. And Marina is, of course, very interested in, don't misunderstand me, but very interested in herself. So we did a perfect kind of avatar of her, and Olafur is someone interested in all perceptual possibilities, and why would he not try AR and VR? He did, and he will, and I'm sure this will develop. Anish Kapoor, a British artist who we have been working with, did a piece together with his son, and Anish has been quite eloquent talking about these things, and actually quite interesting to listen to. He did the whole thing out of curiosity. And now we don't have the sound here, but his son composed the strange music, and it's a kind of inner journey. It's a journey through yourself. Sounds a little bit new agey, and I guess it is almost, because it's originally it was almost the first shot was you were in a car and a car crashing. So it's maybe it starts with your passing away, and then you the piece is called Fall into Yourself, Fall. And Anish gave a big interview for, I think it was Financial Times, where he talked about the possibilities, but also the risks with this medium, that, it's so visually overwhelming that you can easily think that you're producing sublime things, but maybe what you're doing is actually kitsch. And in a way, I don't think his piece is kitsch, but it's a very, very spectacular and overwhelming experience. It's, it produces vertigo, more or less. And being in London, we of course approached some of the people who we happen to know here, and there's a piece by the sculptor Anthony Gormley, who is very well known here, but he did this piece together with an astrophysicist called Priyamvada Natarajan, a woman from India. And she's a pretty well-known cosmologist. I mean, she writes for the New York Times, and when someone found a new black hole, she will comment on it. No, but really, she's a brilliant scientist. But she's also a public intellectual who likes trying to explain these things. And it's basically a piece that no one would have thought that it's a kind of sculpture work. It's a journey to the moon, more or less. And it was interesting to hear Priya, as one calls her, talking about this in very scientific terms. And one could have thought that this would have been commissioned by NASA or Smithsonian or something. Anthony, of course, thought that this was more of a sculptural exploration, and very interested in the textures and the volumes of the moon, and this is just a very, very brief clip. I mean, these mediums are relatively new. Some of you who are, very techy, and maybe, people who are older colleagues of yours have been aware of the possibilities of virtual reality for years, or actually even decades. But I guess for most people, I mean, including myself, it's a relatively recent possibility. I mean, I was introduced through these conferences just a few years ago in Stockholm, and then I went to a Warner Brothers studio, post-production studio here in London, and saw some, very childish but quite spectacular clips of VR produced for, I think, Disney, or and they were just so damn overwhelming that I thought, God, what is this? What is this going to lead to? And I mean, some of you probably work with AR and VR already, and know more about it technically than I do. But I would say, I mean, I've never, I'm not a very technical person who can, program or code or anything myself. On the other hand, I often say that, I'm not a good chef either, and I like eating. No, but, it's more of a curatorial approach to the whole thing. And I think we're in an interesting moment right now. I mean, I think that, one can compare this paradigm shift to previous paradigm shifts, and maybe we can learn a little bit from previous ones. Not that this would be comparable to photography or video. It's something entirely new. But often there's a moment when something new is introduced, and a certain kind of confusion breaks out, and there are lots of experimentation and maybe exaggerations. And if you read about the introduction of photography, it was, there were many years when one didn't know if this was science or if it was esoteric science, and if photography would kill painting, and there are all these all that confusion. And I guess it's normally once or twice or three times in a century that something radically new appears that changes the very possibility of not only of distribution, but actually the question, maybe the ontology of what an artwork is. And I actually do think, without thinking that I'm exaggerating, that the introduction of immersive technologies in recent years marks such a new era. And I also do think that we live in a, we're in the middle of this window of confusion and experimentation, where things aren't totally defined yet. And of course, AR and VR and mixed reality are different things, but sometimes when I talk to the technicians we work with, they are, they think it's all the same. It's up to us if we want to put them in a, in a kind of closed black space, or if we want to have them woven into our normal reality. And it's not quite true that they're the same, but it's there. We can do this. We've done this mastaba. This is the kind of this is a pyramid-like structure that Christo, the artist who passed away just a few weeks ago, was so interested in. It's actually older than the Egyptian pyramid, and it's there were mastabas in Egypt, but there were also even older mastabas in the Middle East, what today is Iraq. And he always wanted to create an enormous mastaba in Abu Dhabi. That didn't happen. But then there was and now he's dead, and his wife, who always collaborated, passed away many years ago. But we did a VR version of the mastaba that he placed in the lake in the Serpentine, the little lake in Hyde Park. And I don't really know why he wanted this. And I think it was maybe more the Serpentine, the gallery, who wanted it, and we did it for them just as a kind of experiment. But I think Christo saw it more as a kind of form of documentation, but it's actually produced with drones, and it's a quite interesting VR version of the piece. And then just recently we launched an AR version, and that was something that he wanted, so that it's actually a kind of public intervention that only exists in augmented reality. That if you walk around in Hyde Park now, and you kind of download the right app, you can see a perfect replica, or a new virtual version of the mastaba. We can come back to that. Just a few examples of other things. I don't want to bore you with too many artists, but we did something with Natalie Djurberg and Hans Berg, two Swedish artists who become quite visible in Europe, at least in recent years. And they're sculptors and they are video artists, but I think they've found their new medium almost, because now they want to do another piece. And it's I think they've always done installations that are immersive in the sense that you're really in them and you're kind of sucked into spaces with sound and light and cinematic elements. But in VR, they're even more effective. This is the next thing that we're working on with them. And we aren't quite sure if we're going to do a VR version or maybe AR versions or both. Just small clips. There's Norwegian painter called Bjarne Melgaard, who's a quite subversive character, who's very well known in his country, but actually, quite well known in the art world as a painter. And all he's created his own mythology, cosmology, like world, and with certain protagonists that always appear in all the paintings. And here they are, all of them in this film. It's not a film; it's a immersive 360 VR piece, not interactive, but if you're surrounded totally. And it's actually like a retrospective or an introspective, he said at the press conference. We showed this in Berlin, so it's all his works kind of packed into this 12-minute experience called My Trip, which is a kind of rather trippy, hallucinatory journey. I don't know if you know Marco Brambilla. He used to be in your country, or used to be in your town. Marco is an interesting Italian-Canadian guy who he's interesting because he always does everything once. He did a blockbuster movie, and it was the kind of ultimate blockbuster movie in 1993 or something, called Demolition Man. So he was actually a Hollywood producer, and he pulled that off quite well. But then he wanted to be an artist, so he started to do works in the public space. And he's done some quite well-known ones in New York, and now he lives here in London. And there's a piece called Creation, and we're now doing a VR version of it, or it's actually done, but we haven't shown it. And I'll come back to a little bit to the issues now that it's very hard to show VR because in Corona times no one wants to put on some sort of headset, and one can understand that. Mark Leck is a British artist. We helped him with his big show at the Tate. So these are kind of point clouds that, Mark is a little bit of also a kind of hallucinatory artist, I have to say, a little bit like Bjarne. He is from Liverpool, or from some small town outside Liverpool. And when he was a kid, he was a lot of trouble, I think, and he left his parents and he lived under a bridge where he had supernatural experiences. And he's now trying to recreate these kind of strange supernatural experiences in VR. And, it involves mythological figures. And I guess they're, I don't know if they're based on drug experiences or not, but, it's going to be like some sort of hallucination if we ever get done with this. We've also worked with artists who maybe one would not think are close to these mediums at all. I mean, in a way, it's not so surprising to do a VR piece with someone like Mark Leckie, or someone who works as a video artist. It's just a new medium that is kind of somehow an extension of video. And I mean, I sometimes think that the kind of multi-projection installations that, people like Douglas Gordon or Doug Aitken and all of these people did, they were very typical for their moment in the 90s. And I guess a lot of that is easier to realize with the immersive possibilities introduced through VR. But we did a piece with a painter called Rebecca Quaitman, R.H. Quaitman. She's quite well known as a painter, works with good galleries. She lives in New York, and she's always been very interested in Hilma af Klint. Hilma af Klint was this mystic from Sweden who I've been very involved with because we did a big show that it's probably the most the most talked about show I was always ever involved with, because we did versions of it all over the world, and some of you may have seen it in New York at the Guggenheim. It wasn't, I didn't curate that version, but we kind of made her well known all over the world. Rebecca Quaitman is actually the only artist I'm aware of, at least in the US, who was interested in Hilma af Klint already in the, I guess in the 80s or yes, I mean late 80s, and she was a student in France, and she knew about Hilma af Klint, and she always thought that Hilma af Klint was a mystic, tried to create artworks that would take us beyond what we can see with our normal eyes. And she and at the Guggenheim show, Rebecca actually had the kind of the spiral, the rotunda of the Guggenheim, turns and turns and turns, and at the very top, the Hilma af Klint show ended, and a little project by Rebecca started, and she kind of deconstructed a Hilma af Klint painting, and she asked us if we could do a little VR experience. This does not, from these small fragments you can't really see it, but it's like you enter a Hilma af Klint painting and suddenly you're in it. And yeah, Chao Fei, another a woman from China who is always interested in new technologies. She did the first piece with Second Life 20 years ago, and we did this strange sci-fi like piece that was launched at the Serpentine just before the lockdown. So it was only up a few weeks, and it's still there, but they haven't reopened. So it's a bit sad, the whole situation, with not only for VR, for everything, I guess, at the moment, but doesn't make it easier if it's physically installed. This is student work from the Städelschule, actually. And for some of you, I mean, it's maybe when you look closer, not so convincing, but some of you may see what it is. It's a kind of, virtual reality version of the large glass by Duchamp. And, it's Damian, who is now teaching with you, who actually realized this together with students. And I think it's a wonderful thing. We actually used it. I curated a small show for Frieze, the art fair in New York, and we put together a program of different works with some well-known artists like Olafur and Natalie Jurberg. But we also had the kind of intro. One of the programs had this as an intro, a 2-minute version of the large glass in VR, and the other program had the Hilma af Klint intro. So in a way, it was like a little art historical speculative kind of introduction that maybe some artists can be said, artists from different periods, somehow anticipating the possibilities that VR actually introduces. I mean, this is something one cannot prove, and it's a very speculative thing to say, but I guess some artists one has the sense that they kind of try to realize things that maybe cannot be realized with the means or the tools they have access to. And I heard a lecture by Slavoj Žižek once where he said that some novels from the 19th century, I think Emily Bronte was his example, that they're written like film scripts, that they want to be film. I mean, they are film, but there is no such thing as cinema yet. So they have the flashbacks and the double exposures, and it's just an example. And one can find other examples. I mean, people have often said that Borges, the Argentinian fantastic writer, that he kind of produced hypertext in the 1920s, that his short stories are somehow anticipating the world of digital possibilities. And I think one can find examples of that, and perhaps one can say that Hilma af Klint wanted to do things that one could not do with painting, and maybe they actually anticipate possibilities. And Duchamp always seems to have anticipated everything, so why wouldn't he have anticipated virtual reality too? And more recently, not only because of the lockdown, but it's been clear that VR is an interesting world. It's visually overwhelming, and it does introduce fantastic possibilities, but it's also quite difficult to exhibit. I mean, it's okay the way we've done it at the Serpentine or a few places in Germany with a few headsets, and this at Frieze I think we had 8 or 10 headsets, and if you do a program you can actually reach normal audiences. But augmented reality, of course, has a totally different possibility when it comes to distribution or reaching big audiences. And the very first thing we did in AR, I mean, many assets in the VR works could easily be turned into AR works. But the first thing that we launched as an AR project was actually a little ice cube by a Korean artist called Koo Jong-ah. That's her. Koo lives here in London, and it's an interesting painter, and she makes drawings, and she makes beautiful small installations, very modest often. And this ice cube, I think, is meant as a little cipher for climate issues, but it's also very kind of intelligent ice cube because it has a few mechanisms built into it. In the evening it turns yellow when the sun goes down, and it breaks the lights, and it reflects the light. It looks very real when you take photos of it. And this was a piece that we showed at Frieze. Frieze is a commercial art fair, but they also do non-commercial things. So they always have this big sculpture exhibition in Regent's Park. So they asked us to introduce a AR project. So we did this with Koo Jong-ah. And the woman who runs Frieze explained in the press, in The Guardian actually, that this was the first big sculptural work that had no carbon footprint. And we all nodded and said, yes. I mean, in a way, it's true that it doesn't involve traveling and shipping and insurance and all of that. But on the other hand, I think we should all be aware that everything digital and everything based on the internet actually is not totally harmless when it comes to climate issues and energy politics at all. These big server parks or server farms are actually unbelievably energy sucking machines, and it's a whole the so-called virtual world is not so virtual. It's actually linked to physical things, and it's linked to, and it has challenges that are very similar to other more traditional institutions when it comes to energy issues. But anyhow, in the world of AR, one can do quite grand things without shipping anything and without traveling and all of that. And this is a Polish German artist called Anish Kapoor, who is well known in Germany, and suddenly she became pretty visible in New York because she had these massive sculptures on the roof of the Metropolitan Museum for a while. I think this is a year ago, and for a show that she did at the List Gallery at MIT, and she asked us to realize one of the things that she hadn't been able to realize in AR, and it wasn't maybe perfect, the whole issue of anchoring and geolocation and geotagging and all of that has improved a lot since then. So it was a little bit shaky, but she wanted us to present it anyhow because it's work in progress, she called it, and it was quite popular actually at MIT. People liked looking at it through the app. So it's just a massive object. This doesn't, maybe the photos are not so great. The interesting thing is that when people walk around in it, that it actually does look very real, that when people take pictures of it and send it to their friends in emails or on social media, one cannot say if they are the real or the physical objects are real. And I think in our social media embedded, social media permeated world, the AR world probably will become very big because it's something that is in a slightly childish or naive way quite amusing, that one can place things everywhere and you can share it, and now I don't have great images. This is a little bit more backstage material that I can just run like this without this is stuff, this is the things that we have never shown, but it's just footage from our productions. So you don't need to pay attention, but it's just, you know, backstage material basically. But in a way, the whole Corona situation that suddenly closed down everything also, I mean, compared to other institutions, of course, we were not so hit because we don't run big, we're not a museum, we're just a studio. But we had nice collaborations in Portugal and in Germany and here in England, and everything just closed down. So, you know, then we thought, why don't we actually push some of the AR works a little bit, you know, we established a new app, and you can check it out. I mean, we have an old app called Acute Art X, and that has some VR and AR works on it, but it's not very active, and that was always linked to institutional collaborations. So when we did something for free, so for a museum somewhere, the app was kind of, you know, necessary for viewing some of the things. But we launched a new app, which is simply called Acute Art, where we've done AR projects that are, you know, really exploring the world of geo-tagging and you know, and it's getting better and better that, you know, things that are a little bit shaky are now no longer so shaky, and one can ultimately actually, you know, curate things in AR, and you can place things on a table, and they are actually quite stable, almost as stable as the glasses and the cups standing there. And we did a project. We helped a street artist who's become very big now in the art world, and not only in the art world. You must know, or I'm sure you have seen his stuff because they're everywhere. Called Kaws, Kaws, and he's, you know, actually someone who's now suddenly quite huge even in the commercial art world. But he comes from street art and from graffiti and through, you know, and he started to collaborate with lots of brands, and he wanted to test an AR work, and he launched this AR piece in, you know, just a few days before lockdown. And I have to say that it's reached bigger audiences than anything that I've done in the normal world, including the Venice Biennale. You know, he's also kind of, you know, has very influential friends and colleagues. So, you know, the moment he launches a thing, and it's one of his typical figures, and it's shared by, you know, Pharrell Williams and Victoria Beckham and Virgil Abloh and a few other friends of his, that's the first 100 million people, you know, viewing his things. You know, I'm saying this, you know, without saying that everything has to be like that. It's not that we only want to work with artists like that, but it's an interesting fact, of course, that you know, this world can reach audiences of a different kind. And you know, the art world is big, and it reaches, you know, I guess LACMA and MoCA and all the New York museums and all the big European museums. It actually reaches millions of people. But, you know, AR and maybe the future of VR will offer us possibilities to show art also where you don't have to go to a big Western metropolis. You know, that you could actually be in the suburbs of you know, as long as you have access to the internet, you can actually reach. You can have access to aesthetic experiences. This is, of course, not something I would say that we're already doing. It's just, you know, a kind of a, you know, a glimpse of things to come. And I'm wondering a little bit how the world will develop. And when I say that things were fast forwarded, I actually mean that we were thinking about these kinds of issues already, but I thought it had more to do with climate issues. I don't think that, you know, the Biennale model and the art fair model in the art world, and now I'm talking about the art world, and I know some of you are, you know, rather in the architecture world, but the art world has really been dominated by events, and I've been very much part of that world, and one should remember that it hasn't always existed. I mean, there are a few exceptions. The Venice Biennale is actually, you know, was founded in 1895. It was almost like an Olympics of art or something. But the whole world of, you know, that every little city has its own biennial, and you know, that people fly to another continent just to have, you know, cocktails and then look at some art, and then they fly back. I don't think this is going to last, and it simply can't, and it shouldn't. and you know, that world of yeah, of biennials and fairs and events will be, I mean, I think it's already kind of fading a little bit, and I wonder what will come next. And I wonder a bit if maybe these new technologies can be part of a new art world. I don't know how, and I'm not saying that we're already doing this. We're just testing and exploring these things with artists. We're not trying to restructure the art world. But of course, I'm sometimes asked what I think that, you know, will happen to these things, and I don't know what will happen. I think, you know, the idea that everyone would look at art at home with a VR set is a very gloomy idea. I don't think that that's how the art world will develop, and I don't think that's how the world should develop. You know, I think art exhibitions and probably also architecture exhibitions and other kind of cultural events, they're there because we like sharing things and we like having conversations and you know, fights about aesthetic and political issues, and I think that's what, you know, why the art world is so popular. You go to with friends and you share things, and I don't think that will ever go away. I think, you know, local exhibitions happening in LA will always be popular for people in LA, and you know, in smaller cities there will also be art fairs or maybe not fairs, but art shows and museums. And I think it's more the kind of global monstrous art world that developed in recent you know, decades with mega galleries and art fairs that, you know, happen for a weekend in big cities, and people travel and you know, also biennials. You go to a small biennial somewhere and have a conversation about global heating, and then you fly home. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, and I think, you know, these things will slowly be replaced. I don't know how, and I'm not sure, but I mean, already what we're doing right now, this is actually very meager platform that we're using, Zoom, but you know, we do meet and we do have conversations and share things through new technologies, and this is not a very immersive or wonderful experience, but it's a way to stay in touch. And I'm thinking a little bit that maybe, you know, in the futures, the local nodes or the local centers with local productions and will be linked through these this is, you know, through these new forms of connectivity. But now I'm starting to speculate about the future of the art world, and I don't know if that's, you know, my main mission or but you know, one wonders. Many people ask, of course, you know, what will happen to these kinds of works. We have shown them in museums, and you know, we have shown them at big art fairs, and we haven't commercialized this. You know, it hasn't been, you know, about selling. And of course, some of these artists, if you work with Anish Kapoor, of course, you know, we're working with one of the most attractive people in the commercial art world that people are willing to you know, to spend money on. But we haven't actually, and Anish has not pushed us. And you know, one could of course do an edition of his VR work, and I'm sure sell it, and you know, have an edition of 5 and 2 artist proofs, or you know, that would be the classical way. But it would feel almost a little bit like a step backwards or something, you know, that to pretend that the VR experience is actually a you know, something that can be compared to a photograph or you know, there's nothing wrong in artists wanting to sell their things. They have to make a living, and it would be interesting for a thing like Acute also to find a sustainable financial model. But we haven't really explored that yet. With AR, I'm thinking that, you know, the things we've done so far has been mainly to just reach big audiences and see what happens. But you know, who knows? Maybe one can actually collect AR works. I don't know what people think in the architecture world. If there's the kind of, are they valuable? Can one do a kind of AR object and say that it exists only once and it's geolocated in, you know, in Frank Gehry's garden, and there it sits and it's very valuable? I don't know. I mean, we haven't explored that either, but we're of course thinking about it, that one could, you know, produce AR works that that exist in small editions, and that, you know, so one could reintroduce the scarcity that we all thought that maybe digital art didn't have. there we go. How do I stop shares there? Hey, so I don't want to see that backstage material anymore. So wow, 50 minutes. It's 6:50 here. I don't know how to summarize this, so I will just stop talking and ask you if there's, if this made any sense, or if there are comments or questions.
No, it was a great lecture and very educational for our students to see how many incredible artists you have been working with, and also your take on the future, which is truly what I was hoping you will give to the students, is a sense of what you imagine this technology being able to do in the future, and maybe how we can relate to this technology now that we are home, and that becomes one of the medium that we have to communicate and share ideas. I would like to ask the students, who some of them actually are working with this technology, if they have questions or a provocation for you to respond to. I'm sure that some of them have questions. You guys can put this into the chat or just unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Yeah, anything is, I'm not sure I will be able to answer, but any question is welcome.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. I am personally working on a project. My thesis is called the Z object. So I'm working on sort of like what you just finished with, like sort of objects that are in an architectural scale. Like they actually in VR, they don't exactly have any scale. We could resize them to occupy them. But I am working on objects, and they're sort of like interactive platforms for us to like collaborate and interact. So I think most of your presentation was like in terms of like artwork and sort of like the immersive environments. So I was wondering if you could like sort of elaborate on what you think about VR or AR as a platform for interactive pieces.
Yeah, I think what's really missing with and clearly missing when it comes to our little app. It's only a few weeks old, so I shouldn't be too self-critical. But it's the possibility to interact there. I mean, VR. Many people say that VR is so autistic or solipsistic, and therefore it's a little bit sad that you're alone there. And you can find arguments to say that if you read a novel, you're also kind of alone. And if you go to the cinema, maybe you can hold your boyfriend's hand, but you can also actually you experience this pretty much alone, and then you talk about it afterwards. There is social VR. I'm sure you all know this, that there are even VR chat rooms and all of this. And there are some people here. It's called, so what are they called? There's a duo here in London teaching at the AA, and they are called something with social.
Space Popular.
Space Popular, exactly. I saw a show of theirs in Scandinavia, and then they had a very popular show here in London, which I missed because it was closed, of course, like everything else. But I read the review, and I know them a little bit, and they are very much in exploring the social aspect of things. And I find them highly amusing as people, but actually I think they also are good. And we had a conversation at the Somerset House with Mark Leckie, and it was interesting to see how the audience was divided a little bit through age, I think, and a general approach. That we had the art world people in Mark's and my age, people in their 50s or something, and they thought VR was death and the end of everything and just horrible and really gloomy stuff and quite and they were deeply depressed. And then there were these kids from AA, and they loved it, and the Space Popular people just said that no, it's fun, and we have parties in VR, and what are you talking about? It's very it's a very social medium, and that was interesting. And Olafur's work is actually an example of social VR, that other people can appear. I mean, if we install it properly, but it's built like that other people can share this beautiful space, but they appear only as lights. But there can be like 7 people, or I think 8 people in there, and in principle one could install it so that they can be in Los Angeles or in Hawaii, and they can be in Korea at the same time, and they enter this thing. It hasn't really been explored fully, but that was, he's of course someone interested in the sharing of things. He doesn't want to produce some sort of gloomy solipsistic space. And when it comes to AR, of course, it's much more you know, that's so easy. People, I mean, it's basically social media embedded, I mean, or I guess, you know, so, I mean, Kos is maybe not the most profound of artists, but come on, what an unbelievably networked person! And these things appear somewhere, and they're documented, it's sent out, and they're just like totally, you know, visible on social media. When it comes to our app, I guess we should all make sure that certain kind of connectivity or interactivity built into it. Right now, it's only participatory in the sense that, you know, I mean, please try it out, and you know, and at some later stage, tell me if it works. But you know, one can download the app. You can place Olafur's little son in your own kitchen. You can place, you know, the ice cube by Ku Jong-ah in your garden, and then you share it through taking a photo and sending it as an SMS, or you know, or an email. Or if you're a social media person, you can of course share it, but it can also be more, you know, intimate. So it does have a kind of participatory interactive aspect. But it's maybe we haven't really built a platform yet. I mean, I think I don't really know how we should do it, and we're not trying to, you know, create a new Facebook or a new. We're actually trying to realize some artists' projects, but I can see that is those mechanisms are necessary for it to become very, you know, very popular, I guess. And I mean, when it comes to Christo, I was just interviewed, and unfortunately, Christo is not anymore what he actually thinks. It was conceived with him, but then he died, you know, and it's now launched. So there's a site-specific version of the huge mastaba now in Hyde Park. So a few people actually go there and look at it. I mean, it hasn't been, in spite of the fact that all museums are still closed and it's actually not much to do in this town, it hasn't been so popular yet, but you know, people actually do go and look at it. But then, you know, if you open the app, you can also place the mastaba yourself. And I think, Kumran, I think it's interesting that, you know, it's a massive object. As you said, you do very big things, because we felt that we have to be respectful to the mastaba. You know, all the things that Christo did were very, very specific and exact, and so it's all about measurement and specific placing. And now that he allowed us to do a kind of participatory version of the mastaba, we felt almost, did he understand what we did? Because now you can place the mastaba in your garden, but we always wanted it to look big because it is big. So when you open the app right now, you're too close to it to even see what it is, and you have to, you know, distance yourself, and then you see that this is a massive object. So the whole question of volumes and size and scale and all of that is, of course, very interesting. And I mean, he's a key artist when it comes to public interventions in public space. I guess that's what he spent his life doing. So I think AR is an incredible instrument there. And I mean, I can't even start thinking about what it means for the architecture world. I just think it's probably going to be a very, very interesting thing. Olafur Eliasson said something funny, because I made a little Zoom, or what do you call it, Insta conversation with him, and I hinted at this, you know, that in the future this will become rather normal and mainstream. And he said that, you know, very soon you will be very surprised when you get an email and there's no AR attachment to it. So I don't know if this is going to happen as quickly as he thinks, but I guess it is, you know, a possibility that will come rather quickly.
Hi, Daniel.
Hey.
Thank you so much for that lecture. We're really happy to have you today. With regards to AR, you know, about how, I mean, I have like toyed with the cause AR myself, and I've been wondering for a while now how when a certain, like even the mastaba, when it's like designed for a certain location in a certain atmosphere, and when its materials and qualities and structure is being influenced by the location, how would displacement of the object and conversion into the digital world and displacement of it affect both the location and the piece of art itself?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I don't know, Sadvi, but I would say our philosophy, or our, you know, what we claim being, you know, quite honest about it, but has always been that, you know, we want to realize things that, you know, could only be realized in the medium in question. And I would say that, you know, if I'm honest about it, I would say some of the works, like Anish Kapoor's piece, definitely is that. It's a totally VR specific, unbelievably strange experience that no one has had before, and it could not have been done as a piece of sculpture or even as a film. And I would say that Olafur's piece, and he's a bit critical of it himself because it's relatively close to what he has done in the physical world. So it's almost like an electronic version of his well-known rainbows and everything. And when it comes to Christo, in a way, the site-specific piece is, you know, it's a replica. I mean, I wouldn't say that this is a new art piece. It's something that you know, he himself was very interested in the dialectics of presence and absence and memory and perception, and, you know, so that's why his pieces were always only up for a few weeks and then they were gone, and all you have are pictures or memories and all of that. So in a way, AR, I mean, this sounds like an easy way out, but in a way AR is a mysterious thing because it's ghost-like. It's like spectral art. Nothing is there, but, you know, then it's very much there, and you take a photo of your, you know, friends standing in front of the mastaba and it looks super real. And so the whole idea of intervention, what do you call it in English, intervention art, or, you know, the whole, you know, it's a whole it's such a big tradition, you know, and that, you know, we will see. I mean, I'm sure there are artists in your part of the world, because it's so techy, that are already exploring this. But in Europe, we have done some of the very first things, I have to say. And so I don't really know if there will be, you know, a real AR tradition when it comes to, you know, doing things that are politically, you know, thought through, and, you know, that, you know, kind of introduce things in environments that are, you know, I wouldn't say that the mastaba is surprising, and so it's maybe a cause, but they're not like really critical works. They're kind of playful and exploring possibilities. But you know, I wonder what, you know, someone like Daniel Buren, or, you know, people who really do interventions in public political space, how they're going to use this, and how this is going to kind of develop. I don't know.
I remember when I saw Cao Fei work on My Second Life 20 years ago, which was not, you know, yet VR, AR. I thought it was actually quite interesting critically what she did with it. And I don't know what the new work she's done for you guys in the Serpentine Pavilion. So I've seen only always the same picture. Yeah, so I was wondering what the experience is. But I thought she was one of the few people that I thought embraced gaming and Second Life very early on with the perfect commentary on society, which I thought was interesting.
Her piece is really, I mean, I think it's one of the better things, at least, that we've done. And it's not clumsy, it's very exact. And, you know, it starts in her studio, and it's also shown in a physical version of her studio, her kitchen. So the whole idea of putting on glasses that, you know, you can have, what do you call it, camera mode, and you enter in it, you're still in that space, and then click, suddenly you're in a virtual version of the space, but you maybe don't even quite notice because it's exactly the same. And then some sort of dreamlike journey begins. And you know, it's just I can't remember now, 8 or 10 minute long experience. But yeah, she wouldn't have done it if she wouldn't. I mean, she's very kind of yeah, I mean, I shouldn't say this because it sounds like the other artists are not serious or something, but she's very serious when it comes to technology-specific possibilities. And we'll see if it's the only VR thing she's done so far. She did something very commercial. What was it? BMW car or something? She's done AR, and we're trying to find new ways to work with her because we like her a lot, but we'll see. And I mean, and it's also kind of interesting Chinese. You know, her studio happens to be in a, I mean, this is a little bit connected to what Sadhvi asked about, because she's interested in the history of her own studio, which sounds boring, but it's not, because the studio happens to be in a space in Beijing where they developed the first computers in China. And these computers were actually Russian. It was a kind of Cold War period when Russia and China collaborated on new digital possibilities. So all the things that maybe some of us have read about when it comes to MIT and you know, things like that, Cold War spirit in the US and IBM and, you know, whatnot, that whole digital archaeology is actually quite interesting. I shouldn't pretend that I know anything about it. I only know what I've heard Chao Fei telling me. But, you know, her piece is about that. It's a kind of love story between a Russian scientist and a Chinese scientist. And, you know, and they end up in some sort of strange, they get stuck in virtual space, basically. But anyhow, I interrupted you, Elena, sorry.
No, actually, I'm really happy to hear the story because I always wondered what it was. I couldn't see more. No,
nice. I hope we can, you know, right now it's only shown in places when you have to go there and it's, you know, a few headsets. I'm hoping that she will accept that we do a 360 version of it, which means that one could actually stream it. But, you know, we have, you know, the way that we actually streamed Ai Weiwei, which is not technically impressive at all, but, you know, that, you know, many people probably did not see it in a headset. They just saw it on the screen, you know, if you, but as you all know, YouTube now actually carries 360. So, you know, one can put things on YouTube and then you can put it in a Google card box and you have an immersive experience. It's maybe not the most overwhelming version of it, but it is getting easier.
Yeah.
I have one more question if no one else has a question.
Yeah.
Since you've already like experienced most of these art pieces and you have like all, you know, you probably have gotten like the feedback of all the viewers and the consumers of these art, like how important do you think is the role of a ground? I think this is more of an architectural question that we always have, but in terms of like the experience in VR, like how important do you think the ground is? Or do you even think like there should be like elements of relatability to the real world, like for people to relate to that art? And if not, like what do you think is more successful in that world?
Yeah, I mean, a very practical answer is that people actually throw up if there's no ground. I mean, you get very dizzy and, you know, maybe you don't throw up, but you become totally, you know, it's so destabilizing anyhow, the whole thing. And maybe it's still clumsy and it will become better, who knows. But it is, you know, Marina Abramovich tried to invent some sort of ridiculous, you know, shaking floor. And you know, we knew that it wouldn't work, but it was actually totally impossible. People would fall and they would get hurt and they would, you know, so this is the practical answer. I think, now I'm just thinking, you know, aloud here, but you know, with Anish, you know, he I know him a little bit, and you know, so it started as some sort of conversation simply, and you know, and then suddenly he wanted to do this, but he couldn't really find a topic or a subject matter, you know, something, and he came up with the idea of vertigo. That, you know, the falling is the kind of thing that actually works. Most other things don't work yet because they're not exact enough and they're like not so good and they're a little bit, you know, so he thought that so it's a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, his piece, that, you know, you walk and suddenly you're just falling into some sort of hole or something, and the falling is not so bad, so you get used to it, but you know, you could not, I mean, but you need, so there is no ground there perceptually, but you actually have to stand. I mean, since I've been very pushy with these things and I introduced every damn curator in London to come and look at these things in our studio, I have very amusing photographs of Sir Norman Rosenthal and other people of that generation who are like in their 70s or 80s, who are totally losing, you know, they're more like they're holding a table and they think they're going to fall and they take off the headset because, and it's maybe not only a generational thing, but you know, I think your more a more philosophical interpretation of your question, I don't really know how to answer. But the practical one is that you need some sort of, you have to be somewhere to go somewhere and experience something. But I mean, the question of the grounding things in architectural sense, I don't know. We're trying to work with do you know, Thomas Saraceno. He's an Argentinian artist who used to work with Olafur, and he's actually an architect. He's kind of the most, he was the worst student the Städelschule ever had, but he turned out to be the biggest success because he left architecture and became this famous installation artist. And he's actually, his only education is architecture. And he wanted to do balloons, and he came to the school with the idea to do balloons, and he left the school doing the same balloons. So I don't think we contributed much to his kind of, education, but he came out with the, the idea to do lighter than air technology and, architectures that would hover. And he's very interested in Buckminster Fuller and things like that. And I'm sure there are more contemporary things that I'm not so aware of. And so he wants to do really hovering structures in AR and VR, and they would not be grounded. He wants them to be, floating, but we'll see.
Thank you.
But also we have not realized anything yet, so I'm not sure where this is going.
Hi, Daniel. I also had a question. Thank you so much for the lecture. But I was kind of curious when you spoke about responsiveness. Specifically, I think you said that art has always been responsive to like these movements that are happening. I was curious whether in like what you've seen through the trajectory of what's happened, like whether this kind of experience mirrors any of the movements that you've seen in the past. And then I guess my next second question would be like, which you've kind of touched on already, but what are kind of the new challenges that are asked of the artist specifically, not specifically the art, but like the creator of the art? It seems like there's kind of a new need for them to brand or market themselves outside of what they normally would do, like through, curator or what have you. So that was just something I was wondering.
Yeah. The first part of it, or rather your first question, would responding to like big political issues, or what do you think?
I guess, yes, obviously that's happening right now.
Yeah.
But you had mentioned like movements. I guess I was speaking to movements in technology, like we are being asked to produce, we've talked about AR, VR, but produce solely like through digital means. Like we don't have the ability to engage with the art in person at like a certain city where they would be exhibited. So one is technological movements, but also like obviously now there are so many social movements that are super relevant and important that people are being vocal about now. Which obviously has happened in the past, so I was just curious.
No, but when there is a new kind of technological breakthrough, it seems to be always almost a given that artists will start using these things also, and often in a kind of not necessarily in a very kind of polite way. It can also be, that you want to deconstruct when Bruce Nauman and Joan Jonas started to play around with the first video cameras, and they kind of deconstructed it. It was like a sabotage of the medium rather than a kind of a friendly, consumer friendly version of it. So very boring. I think of Warhol's films are the most boring possible, so the question is, will there be kind of more deconstructive will there be ways to kind of approach these new possibilities in a way that isn't so, where you don't necessarily just play along with what the medium seems to ask you to do? And that's, there are, in the AR world now, we have lots of things that, will be much more, what should I say, explicitly political actually, when, and reacting to, and there are things with younger artists right now, and we're trying to do it with them, and it will be, reacting to Black Lives Matter and many other such, contemporary, but very recent developments. But we're not close to even having, something that is close to being realized. But the idea of intervention. There is something quite interesting that no one can stop anyone from. There's no clear legal structure. We could place an AR object on the roof of your school, and you wouldn't know how to get rid of it. And it's not there because it's on your telephones, or it's on servers somewhere in Arizona or something.
Don't give them ideas.
Yeah, but for most of them, we actually did place that ice cube in the garden of the Bayle, the most sophisticated and prestigious of institutions in Switzerland, and then we but it was not in any way critical, or but we said, as a joke, we said to the director, but of course it might be here forever. And then next Monday I get an email saying, can you please remove it? So we did that, of course, but we could intervene, and one could play something on the White House, and one could play. I don't think it's so easy to kind of so I think there are incredible political possibilities of all the things that one can do with interventions in public space or in social, it will come, and I don't know, what one, if we did something like that in China, they would of course just simply take down the app, because working with Weiwei, we have been thinking that maybe we should do an interesting AR object with him, but it will simply mean that the app is no longer active in China. So should we then do that, or should we not do that? I mean, it's not a given. It's like, should we just which side are you on? Are you on the Chinese government side here or something? No, but we still want the app to be kind of active, and they will take it down in a microsecond. So it's also interesting that politically one is so. I mean, we've had small seminars in the Städelschule about these new mediums, and there are lots of interesting political texts already. The whole the whole surveillance capitalism. There's a book called Surveillance Capitalism, which just shows that a small number of companies like Google and Apple and all of those that one is dependent on, their power is just immense, and they it's all about surveying and about gathering data, basically, that can be used for consumption and commercialization and all of that. So it's not an easy territory. It's not an easy environment if you think that you want to be an autonomous operator, and a kind of your agency is kind of always a little bit limited. If you have an app, for instance, you have to get it through the nail's eye of the App Store, because if the App Store and Google Play don't accept it, your app will not be there. So I mean, there are lots of things that one should not be naive about. That one should understand that we're playing along here with even if our artists are not in any way in contact with these big giant companies or anything. They're doing what they want to do, and we try to help them. There is we are embedded in a techie landscape that we cannot kind of control at all. This was not a good answer. You had a second question.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much an open-ended question about what's asked of artists to like kind of proceed.
Sorry?
I think the question was more like, what is, I guess, the role now of the artist? What is kind of asked more of the artist, I guess, to kind of disseminate?
I have, although I've never worked in the gallery world or in the auction house world or anything, but someone just told me that, that the art world is changing in this world, that even the most expensive artists are still, the big names and all of that. But it's that supposedly it's now very important for artists to have like massive following on social media and so on. And maybe not all of them, but it seems to be like, it's a bit strange that, it used to be that artists could hide and be subversive and not visible and, not play along. And I'm sure there will be possibilities of that kind of approach too. But I mean, the whole world of pop, if you think about the pop artists having roots in certain European, I mean, say it starts with Salvador Dali or something. Where the artist persona is as important as the artworks, maybe more important in his case, him with his mustache and, the whole thing. And that going all the way up to Jeff Koons or something, where, you're part of the artwork piece or something. This of course it's an older story, but now in this world of becoming visible through social media, I mean, it's kind of sad if this is a necessity for every artist to be kind of your own promoter or something. I don't really know. but I don't know if it's the same in, I mean, in architecture is different, I guess. I mean, architects have to sell themselves, otherwise they will never build anything.
Yeah, definitely we are. So there is another question from John Cooper. I see him wanting to unmute himself. So let's hear it.
Yeah, thank you. No, well, it's really about the collection and display and archiving of these kinds of objects. And I think, you know, within the kind of, you know, traditional art object and its place in the market, it could be, and this is sort of outside of the major sponsoring, patronizing institutions that have been kind of mentioned, but you could collect prints and you could bind them together in folios, you could circulate them, they could operate, you could display some of them occasionally, put them back, share them with others, and build up your kind of own archives and collections. And, you know, in many cases on that sort of more localized autonomous level, that would kind of do two things. One, it would enter into the architectural realm by modifying the interior. And, you know, that's the John Soane's Museum, you know, maybe the most obvious example of a kind of space that is produced by the collection of objects.
Yeah.
But those collections could also become the basis of more kinds of collective like solidarities and emergent identities. They could become the centers of like new communities, and to build up an archive was also to store a kind of history and therefore to take on a sort of agency in the world. So the question of like collecting and archiving of these objects, and it seems that so many of them are only like remotely accessible.
Yeah.
And so whilst one can experience them in a sort of kind of discrete fashion, one can't kind of appropriate them to one's own use. And I just wonder what you think about that, and whether you're kind of aware of any sort of, I don't know, subversive tactics that people have found to gather these objects and like strategically co-opt them into their own regimes of collecting and displaying. And
it is, I mean, I think it's just a huge challenge that you know, it's just a few months ago that we produced the first AR object, so we haven't been too worried about the museum's approach or the archiving on the long term. But of course, it's, I mean, super relevant questions. 20 years ago, I was asked to curate a little show for MIT. And there's people somewhere close to where you are, or I think maybe in San Francisco, called the Kramlichs. It's a couple. And the Kramlich collection was famous back then as being the most important video art collection in the world, or media art, or like time-based art collection, all of that. And all the museums were fighting to kind of get the donation that they would, you know, if the Kramlich would just give them the damn thing, they would have the most impressive video collection in the world. Instead, they built their own building in with what's the Herzog and de Meuron, I think, and my anecdotal, sorry, this is a long digression, but you know, I thought that having MIT, I could, you know, show everything. The most powerful technical university, I guess, in the world should be able to help me to show all these things. We could hardly show anything because these works were no longer really available. I mean, one needed hardware, one needed, you know, special kinds of projectors, and, you know, it ended up being quite problematic. And I mean, I did the show anyhow, but many of the pieces were too expensive or too complicated to show, because they did exist in some sort of philosophical world, and they were owned by these Kramlichs, but one couldn't show them. So of course, I wonder a little bit when it comes to VR. I mean, I'm pretty aware that some of our objects already are totally obsolete. The Marina Abramović piece is totally obsolete. You know, it's an interesting thing because people love it because her voice is there, and you know, and she's so famous or something. But you know, and it's also fun, and it's, you know, interesting and everything. But it already looks very old, although it's like 3 years old, 3.5 years old or something. So I mean, the obsolescence of things is sometimes attractive also. Some artists like obsolete objects rather than new objects. So it's you know, and they get some sort of patina and in, you know, almost aura when they are no longer new, and they have no, you know, and they they belong into some sort of world of ruins and old things and so on. I don't know how people will collect AR and VR work so far. I mean, just talking to some of the people that we want to do AR works with, people say that, it's been a very generous approach, I have to say. I mean, we're funded by a few people who are like art collectors, and they just want this to happen for a while. In the long run, there has to be some sort of sustainability. Otherwise, if nothing is ever sold and there's no income, I don't think Acute Art will survive forever. But we haven't been too pushy about it. But when we produce AR works, people want to say that we want to take, I have the right to the piece, and we say, of course you have the right to the piece, you're the artist, but I have to be able to remove it and show it wherever I want. And we say, yes, but where the hell will they show it? There is no other app than our app right now. So it's a little bit, but this of course will change, and people build their own apps, and but could one actually hack into these things and build one's own anarchic collection? I mean, it's almost like you're asking such, I don't know, but I mean, it's very early days. I think we're in the stone age of this stuff, and I don't really know. But I mean, someone said that in the architecture world and in the urbanistic kind of research world, people think that in the future there will be no signage, and cities will be naked, everything will be AR. That there will be no street names because it's all augmented reality or mixed reality, and so maybe we will live in some sort of weird hybrid world of with layer after layer of augmented stuff, and if we don't have the right prism, the kind of right application to look at the stuff, the world will be very bare and look, John, I don't know how to answer your question, but it's a good one, but you should research it.
Daniel, thank you for your time. I also wanted to say a small anecdote to the students. We were put in touch by a gallery in Turkey, Science. I had my work in augmented reality with them, and there was the work of Into Yourself Fall, and that's when, yes, I realized that they are now organizing, I think, a show with you about augmented reality work. And it was interesting because as soon as it opened, the show was closed by COVID. And I think a lot of the question that the show was asking about touch, because everything that was in that show was about the idea of touching, and the idea of this virtual reality somehow became quite predominant. And so I thought, what a good opportunity to talk to you and Acute Art about the next phase of art. I want to thank all the students, and I just want to ask if there is no more questions. Thank you, Daniel, for your time. I'm sure that you've been a provocation to their thoughts, and a lot of what you've said was actually instrumental for me as well as an instructor. Thank you for your generosity and your intellectual capacity to embrace ideas beyond what they seem to be now. I know that now, yes, it's a Pac-Man era of AR, but it will not be the case for a long time. And so it's great to have your inputs and your vision that I'm sure will inspire our students. I will also leave to Florenza the microphone. I think you have a couple of announcements, both for our 2 p.m. meeting and our 6 p.m. meeting. So I know that at 2 p.m. you guys are meeting with Rodney about thesis and the construction of your models, and at 6 for the movie night.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, so much for this lecture. It was amazing. We have it recorded, so I think that students can go and Google every one of the artists that you recommended